In the early morning hours of September 21st, 2009, a man was asleep in his bed in New Orleans when suddenly he heard the sound of metal clinking in the dark corner of his room. And so he sat up. The man's heart raced as he stared around the room, looking for where the sound came from. And then suddenly he saw it. There was a figure in his room standing right there, staring at him. And then the figure began to move towards him, and as it moved closer, the clinking sound he was hearing got louder. And the man realized this figure, was wrapped in all these heavy metal chains. And suddenly the man understood what he was seeing was a ghost. And this man knew exactly who had murdered them. But before we get into that story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right show, because that's all we do. So if that's of interest to you, please take pictures of the follow button's brand new car and list it for sale online. Okay, let's get into today's story. In the early afternoon on April 13th, 1985, 60-year-old Dorothy Thompson walked into a bank in St. Bernard, Louisiana. Her hip was really bothering her, so she was moving slowly, but at the same time she was also trying extra hard not to limp or seem unsteady. She knew the people in her small town liked to gossip about her, and so she didn't want to give them anything new to talk about. But, as expected, despite her best efforts to conceal her slower, sort of limp-y movement, when she got into the lobby, the handful of tellers and customers that were inside looked towards her, took stock of her, and began whispering. So, the little town of St. Bernard was about 5 miles outside of New Orleans. And it was the kind of place where people were generally pretty friendly and everyone seemed to know everyone. But this smallness made it pretty easy for rumors to spread, and most of those rumors in this town seemed to be about Dorothy. Dorothy did have to admit, though, that she had given people a lot to talk about. Dorothy, who had lived in this town for 39 years, was the owner of the town's pet cemetery. Now, this pet cemetery was actually a true business. Dorothy made her income from pet owners, buying plots of land in the cemetery. But that wasn't really the thing that made, Dorothy stand out as the centerpiece of gossip piece. It was the fact that she not only owned this pet cemetery, but she lived on the cemetery by herself. And considering the fact that the cemetery also had a rumor of being haunted, it just seemed like, how could anybody do that? How could she live there full time? And these ghost stories, surrounding this pet cemetery were not just, to do with animals that have been buried there, but they were about people because people had died on this property, including both of Dorothy's husbands. The first husband was a very heavy drinker who regularly abused Dorothy, and it got so bad at a certain point that she eventually just shot him in self-defense and killed him. So that's how he died. And then her second husband had died from suicide, and Dorothy was the one who actually found his body on the porch. And so these deaths had led to more stories about Dorothy and how she was some kind of husband killer. But what people didn't see was how much all this death really weighed on her. And when her mother died about 6 years ago, it had almost broken Dorothy completely. Dorothy and her mother were incredibly close, and after she died, Dorothy got so depressed that she had to be admitted to the hospital for quite a while. She was doing better now, but some days were still really hard. And so now at the bank, Dorothy ignored the look she got as she approached the teller. She needed to get cash out to pay her handyman, Kenny Palmieri, who'd done some work at the cemetery that morning. And because Dorothy didn't actually drive, Kenny was also her chauffeur for the day, and he was outside right now waiting to take her on a few more errands. So Dorothy told the teller how much money she needed, and then, after they counted it out and handed it to her, Dorothy took the cash, turned around, and headed back outside. A couple hours later, around 4 p.m., Dorothy sat in the passenger seat of Kenny's car as he drove down a highway. They just wrapped up at the grocery store, and now he was taking her back home. As they drove, the two made some small talk, mostly about the weather and also the work that Kenny had done that morning on the grounds. But the truth was, Dorothy didn't really know Kenny at all. I mean, she had just hired him the day before, but he seemed nice enough and she was hoping he would stick around for a while. After all, she had had a pretty high turnover rate amongst her handymen over the last year, and so she was hoping now for some consistency. So both the pet cemetery itself and Dorothy's house, which, again, was on the cemetery grounds, required a lot of upkeep that Dorothy was just not physically capable of doing. Besides her bad hip, she also took medication for her depression that made her weak and sometimes very disoriented. Now, sometimes Dorothy would ask her neighbors for help, but generally speaking, she preferred to just hire people to do the work because, people needed steady work. She could give that to them, and she appreciated the help. However, the problem with hiring these handy men was that, unfortunately, a few of her, former handymen had turned out to be criminals. Last fall, her handyman at the time, this guy named Dilkin Childress, had lived with her and worked on the grounds. But Dilkin was always just sort of wandering around and exploring the property instead of taking care of it. Then she had found out he'd been arrested for robbery, so she guessed that what he was really doing when he was walking around was casing the place, looking for ways to break in or to steal something. Luckily for her, he actually quit before she had to fire him. And the guy before Dilkin was even worse. His name was Brandon O'Dear. Brandon was a total loudmouth who had started working for Dorothy right after her mother had died. He and his wife Bonnie had moved in with Dorothy so Brandon could keep up with the repairs while Bonnie drove Dorothy around. But, just like Dilkin, the issue she ran into with the no-diazess was theft. The previous spring, Dorothy had had this really intense depressive episode and was taking a lot of medication for it. And while she was all medicated and groggy, the no-diazess convinced her to sell them her and for basically nothing. But when Dorothy realized what had happened, she made the no-deers move out and then got a lawyer to overturn the deal that she had signed. And so, since last year, Dorothy, along with the no-deers, had been in this horrible legal fight over this land. And she knew, the no-deers Brandon and Bonnie were furious at her. And on top of that, Brandon, who was this huge loudmouth, just would not stop talking about this dispute. Not only was he talking about it in public, but he also kept contacting Dorothy to sort of talk her into dropping the suit altogether. But Dorothy was not about to drop this issue. I mean, this cemetery and the land had belonged to her mother and now it was hers. Like, it mattered to her, she's not just going to give it up. And so now, sitting in the passenger seat of the car, Dorothy watched as Kenny turned off the highway and eventually pulled into her driveway, which was quite long and wound through some thick woods. Because remember, she lives on the cemetery. It's sort of secluded from society. And as the pair drove along this driveway and got closer and closer to her home, eventually she could finally see some of the tombstones up ahead. This cemetery was enormous, and basically any kind of animal you could imagine was buried here. Some of the graves were just engraved stone slabs, but others were pretty extravagant, including one human-sized Buddhist statue of somebody's pet cat. Kenny finally pulled up in front of the house and got out to help Dorothy carry in the groceries. And when he was done, Dorothy handed over the cash that she owed him and said she would call him when she had more work. Then she watched as Kenny got back in his car and drove off back down the driveway. Around 9 p.m. that night, Dorothy poured herself a healthy glass of wine and went to her bedroom to turn on the TV. She'd spent the evening going through some bills and taking calls from cemetery clients, so by now she was exhausted. But as soon as she got into bed, she heard a phone ring on the other side of the house. Dorothy groaned and took her wine with her as she shuffled down the hallway to the kitchen to answer the call. And when she answered it, she heard her friend's voice, a woman named Patricia Newman. So Patricia was about half Dorothy's age, and the two of them had been introduced by a mutual friend 3 years earlier. Patricia had started out as more of a caretaker for Dorothy since Patricia had experience working with the elderly, but they'd gotten along really well and became quite close, to the point where they had sort of a mother-daughter type of relationship. And since Patricia only lived about 10 minutes away, Dorothy did depend on her pretty much daily for things like supervising her education and driving her to appointments. In many ways, Patricia was like the one person outside of the hired help that she did spend a lot of time with. And so that's actually why Patricia was calling now. She wanted to know if Dorothy still needed a ride to the pharmacy the following day. And Dorothy said that she didn't said, "Thank you." And then the two talked for a bit longer before ultimately saying goodnight. After that, Dorothy hung up the phone and then poured herself a bit more wine, and then she just kind of stood in the kitchen for a bit, listening to the crickets outside. And then, when she was about to finally leave and go back to bed, she heard something. It was the sound of a car making its way slowly up her long driveway. The following morning, a little after 1 p.m., the friend Patricia Newman pulled up outside of Dorothy's house and threw her car into park. Patricia had called Dorothy around 9 and that morning to tell her she was going to be late getting her, but Dorothy hadn't answered. Patricia had tried calling a few more times, but Dorothy never answered, which ultimately made Patricia pretty nervous. Dorothy was a heavy drinker in her 60 seconds and was on a lot of medication. So deep down, Patricia knew it was possible Dorothy wasn't answering because she had some kind of accident or medical emergency. So she was at Dorothy's now, not so much to take her on her errands for the day, but just to make sure she was okay. Patricia got out of her car and hurried up to Dorothy's front door, but when she knocked, there was no answer. And after looking in a few windows, she didn't see Dorothy or any kind of movement inside. It just seemed very quiet and still. Patricia went back to the front door and tried it, but she found it was locked. So she just kept on knocking for a while. And after a few more minutes of Dorothy not answering, and not hearing or seeing any sign of life in there, Patricia felt worried enough that she left the front door and went to go call the police. Not long after that, Patricia was back at Dorothy's house, this time watching anxiously as the police officers forced Dorothy's back door open. The officers had gotten there just a few minutes ago, and Patricia had explained to them how Dorothy, Dorothy, could be inside and very likely was hurt or something was wrong. And so, the officers kind of fanned out and began searching around the house, looking for a way in, and they found the back door was not locked. It was just jammed. So now they were in the process of getting it unjammed. And so finally, after a few swift kicks to this door, it finally gave way and it swung open. And the two officers along with Patricia went inside. Patricia immediately began yelling out Dorothy's name and going room to room, looking for her. And what she quickly realized is she could hear the sound of a television that was on, and it was coming from Dorothy's bedroom. But when she went to the bedroom and looked inside, Dorothy wasn't in there. In fact, after searching the whole house, there was no sign of Dorothy anywhere. And there wasn't any sign of any kind of problem in the house, like there was no disturbance anywhere, no struggle, no accident where somebody fell over. It was just like Dorothy was gone, and that was it. Now for the two officers, they didn't really know what to make of this because to them, it didn't appear like anything horrible had happened. There was no active emergency here. It's just that, this person has left their TV on and they're not here when they should be. And that was concerning, but not enough to warrant a big reaction from authorities. But Patricia, she knew, based on what she was seeing, that this was so uncharacteristic of Dorothy that something definitely had gone wrong here. But even though Patricia really adamantly communicated that concern to the two officers, they just told her that, you know what, let's wait, give it a few days and give Dorothy another couple of calls. And if she doesn't show up in the next few days, come talk to us. And so after the police left, despite Patricia having this sense that something's off here, she did what she was told. She went home, she continued trying Dorothy, but never got an answer. She called around town to see if anybody had seen her or heard from her, but no, nobody knew where she was. And so finally, after 4 days, Patricia put in another call to the St. Bernard Sheriff's Office, and this time she absolutely begged them to do something, because Dorothy Thompson was still missing. And now Patricia was 100% certain that something bad had to have happened to her. At around 10 a.m. on the same day that Patricia has made this plea for help, for days after Dorothy had inexplicably gone missing, Detective Brian V. All-Alongo drove his cruiser through Dorothy Thompson's pet cemetery along with Sergeant Terrence Estrada. Both men worked for the St. Bernard Sheriff's Office, and they had been tasked to look into Dorothy's disappearance. Vale Lungo hadn't even gotten to the scene yet, but he was already uneasy as he drove past the animal tombstones and grave sites. This place had always creeped him out, Finally, the officer's cruiser made their way all the way to the end of the driveway and they reached Dorothy's home. And right away, Vale Lungo could see there was a woman maybe in her 30 seconds who he guessed was Patricia, who was standing by the front door. She seemed visibly anxious and impatient as she stood there waiting for Vale Lungo and Strata to get out of their car. And when they did get out and walked over to her, she got straight to the point. She said the last officers had not actually done a real search of the place, just a sort of basic welfare check. And so now, she needed them to do a full search of Dorothy's house and her grounds to make sure Dorothy really wasn't somewhere on this property. Vale Lungo and Strata assured her that they would do that. But first they needed her to start from the beginning and tell them about the last time she saw or spoke to Dorothy. Patricia seemed pretty irritated by this and said she had already told the officers everything she had known, both on the phone call and then previously with those other officers who had done the welfare check. Like, can we please just get into the search? But Vale Lungo insisted and said, look, I don't fully know the whole story, so please, give me some information. And so, begrudgingly, she would tell Vale Lungo what she knew, basically. That she had called her friend on the 13th at night to ask if Dorothy would need a ride to the pharmacy the next day. She had said yes. And then the next day comes around and Patricia calls her friend to confirm she's gonna swing by and pick her up that morning. But Dorothy doesn't answer. And so eventually, Patricia goes to the house. Dorothy apparently isn't there. She knocks on the door, Dorothy doesn't come out. It just seemed off. And so Patricia calls the police. They show up. They find the back door is unlocked, but jammed. They force it open, they go inside. And, nothing's disturbed and Dorothy is just missing. And there was no rhyme or reason to it. And so now Patricia was convinced that something bad had happened to Dorothy, and she really was hoping that they could help her. Vale nodded and then asked Patricia if maybe Dorothy had friends or family that she might have just gone to stay with. But Patricia immediately shook her head and said, no, Dorothy was pretty much alone in the world and almost never left her house, and she didn't have a car because she didn't drive dog. Also, Patricia said she had already called around and nobody had seen her, friends, family, no one. And then at this point, Patricia was very clear. She told the officers that she believed the only reason Dorothy would have left her house that day, or that night before, was if somebody else had forced her to. Mellowingo shot Strata a look. He didn't doubt that Patricia was worried about her friend, but they need to look around before they jump to any conclusions he was sincere. So he asked Patricia if she could show them the unlocked door, and they would begin their investigation. Moments later, Vale Lungo stepped into the home through that back entrance, followed by Strata and Patricia. As he walked around the house, he saw that, like Patricia had said, it was very neat and tidy. There really was no sign of anything that had gone wrong inside the house, no sign of a struggle or a fall of some kind. It was just like the house was left exactly as it is. That sort of contradicted Patricia's theory that, the only way Dorothy would have left the house was if she had been forced, suggesting some form of a struggle. But at the same time, what Patricia was saying about Dorothy is that she was kind of frail. And so Vale Lungo thought, okay, maybe it's possible that she was forced and, she didn't put up any kind of a fight. And that's why we don't see any disturbance. He didn't know, but it just seemed odd that nothing had been displaced if we're talking about some form of an abduction. Also, as Vale Lungo continued his walk around the house, he could see that items of value, like Dorothy's TV, were still their items, so it didn't seem like this had been a robbery. But, unlike the first officers who had done that initial welfare check with Patricia a few days earlier, Vale Lungo did agree that something wasn't right here, right? Because as he continued to walk around, he kept seeing signs that Dorothy had clearly not planned to leave her home or had left in a hurry. For example, there was a half-empty glass of wine in the kitchen, and the television in the bedroom was still on. And so those are things that simply would not be if somebody was planning to leave for any extended period of time. And also, based on what Patricia had told them, he could rule out a family emergency suddenly taking Dorothy out of town or any kind of last-minute trip, because Patricia had called around and that stuff hadn't happened. At a certain point, Vale Lungo stopped walking around the home and just asked Patricia, how was Dorothy's mental state? And Patricia clearly hesitated for a second before she admitted to Vale Lungo that, Dorothy was on a whole bunch of medication, and sometimes it did make her mental state kind of foggy. And so Vale Lungo naturally thought, okay, maybe it's possible that in a sort of foggy mental state, maybe for whatever reason, she wandered out of the house on her own. And then once she was outside, something happened to her, whether it was, an animal, a person, a fall. Like anything could have happened. He knew the back door had been unlocked during that initial police welfare check-in. Even though he knew the door apparently had been jammed, it clearly had not been jammed so much that it prevented them from getting inside. And so maybe the door just always got stuck, and maybe that's all that happened. She walked out the back door, and when she shut it, it got jammed. And that was normal. And so Vale Lungo turned to his partner and sort of explained to him his theory around Dorothy maybe wandering out on her own, and then something else happened once she was outside and said, hey, she's clearly not here. Let's go out there and search the grounds and see if we can find her. 15 days later, a little past 7. Darom on May 3rd, 1985, Valerengo stepped into Strata's office to give him an update on the case. At this point, Valerengo thought it was extremely likely that foul play was involved here because they had searched. Vale Lungo had searched Dorothy's house and her property a few times at this point, and they had not found Dorothy anywhere or any evidence to explain what had happened to her. Patricia had mentioned that Dorothy had a tattoo of a cross on her left index finger, so Vale Lungo had spent the last couple of weeks calling around to local hospitals and morgues to see if any women had been brought in with that marking. Vale Lungo also interviewed Dorothy's neighbors and the tellers at that bank that she had gone to shortly before she vanished. And also he had interviewed some people in town who just knew who she was. He'd also tracked down Dorothy's new handyman, Kenny Palm-IE, who the bank had said was with Dorothy on the day she vanished. He apparently was driving her around. But none of these people had heard from Dorothy since she vanished 20 days earlier, same as Patricia. Even though nobody knew where Dorothy was and really couldn't offer all that much information to help the investigation, it was like everybody Vale Lungo spoke to had a pretty strong negative opinion of Dorothy, like that she was this recluse, and that she was kind of crazy, and, people thought she had murdered her husbands and buried their bodies in the pet cemetery, and also her house in Hurlin were haunted. But, none of these rumors were going to do anything to advance the case. But it was interesting to Vale Lungo that people felt this way about her. The only real lead that Vale Lungo got was something he got from speaking to Dorothy's lawyer a few days ago, who had mentioned that Dorothy was in the middle of this very contentious lawsuit over the rights to her property with a pair of former employees named Bonnie and Brandon Nodiero. And since Dorothy's case was looking more and more like an abduction or even homicide, the fact that there was this active lawsuit that Dorothy was embroiled in was a big red flag. So Vale Lungo naturally knew he had to speak to Bonnie and Brandon. But as Vale Lungo sat across from Strata at his desk and filled him in on all this, Strata's phone rang. Strata picked it up and listened to the person on the other end, and immediately there was this look of shock that came over his face. Strata thanked the caller and then hung up, and then told Vale Lungo that a body had been found in the Mississippi River the day before, about 40 miles downriver from here, and they thought it could be Dorothy. Just a few hours later, Vale Lungo and Strata stood with Patricia Newman inside of an exam room at the coroner's office. In front of them was a long metal table, and lying on this table was the body of the woman who had been found inside the river. Patricia had been asked to come in here and see if this was Dorothy. But as Vale Lungo looked at the body, he didn't see how Patricia was going to be able to do that, because the body was already incredibly decomposed and very bloated. The medical examiner had said this woman had likely been in the water for weeks, and they hadn't done an autopsy yet, but any findings would probably just be a guess because of how badly damaged and decomposed the body was. The only thing they did know for sure was that this definitely was a homicide. The woman was found with a plastic bag tied over her head, and she was wrapped in a lot of very heavy chains, probably to weigh her down so her body would not float up and be found. And so Vale Lungo looked over at Patricia, who looked visibly anxious as she stared at this body. She seemed kind of overwhelmed by the moment. She was shaking, and she was just staring sort of shocked. But eventually, after looking at the body, she spoke and she actually said that she didn't think this was Dorothy. And for a second, Vale Lungo was actually disappointed. Not because he was hoping Dorothy was dead, but for the sake of the case, to figure out where she had gone. But then he remembered something. He stepped up to the body, he put on a glove, and gently examined the woman's left hand. And there, just visible on her index finger, was a tattoo of a cross. This was Dorothy. For days later on May 7, Vale Lungo got to his office and sat down at his desk to start the day. And he had a lot to do because he was now in the middle of a homicide case. The medical examiner who had done the autopsy on Dorothy didn't find any water in her lungs, so as a result, they had decided the cause of death was most likely asphyxia from strangulation or suffocation, not drowning. Now Vale Lungo had known all along that it was possible somebody had abducted Dorothy from her home and killed her, but now that it was official, he was sort of reviewing the case notes from the beginning to see if anything had been overlooked while this was still basically considered a missing persons case. And he started with the place Dorothy was last known to be, her house known to be. Dorothy's home was incredibly neat and undisturbed, so it was possible Dorothy was lured from her home and killed somewhere else. But Vale Lungo knew from talking to her neighbors and Patricia that Dorothy was, naturally pretty reclusive and did not leave her house easily. So it sort of made the most sense to him that Dorothy must have actually been killed in her home. And the reason the crime scene was so pristine was that Dorothy was overpowered really quickly. Now originally, Vale Lungo had considered Dorothy's current handyman, Kenny Palmai, to be a suspect, since he was the last one to see her alive because he was the one who dropped her off at her home at 4 p.m. around the time she went missing. But Vale Lungo had revisited Kenny and found that he had an alibi. But even if he didn't have an alibi, Vale Lungo wasn't really sure what Kenny's motive would even have been. I mean, there had been no sign of a robbery inside of her house, and on top of that, it just didn't seem like Dorothy had much money to begin with, like she wasn't wealthy. And also the way she died, strangulation or suffocation, that's so personal. And so whoever would have done that would have had to have a reason for it. But so far, Vale Lungo had not spoken to anyone who really had a serious issue with Dorothy. I mean, people definitely had opinions about Dorothy, but it was almost like people said, stay away from her. She lives on haunted land and she's killed her husbands, but it just seemed like rumor mill. There didn't seem to be somebody who really had a targeted issue with her. There was that outstanding lawsuit with the O'Dears, the two people who were, battling over the rights to her property. But it wasn't clear to Vale Lungo if, in the middle of this lawsuit, there was like real hatred between the parties. He had yet to see that, and so at this point, Vale Lungo felt like his biggest problem was that he really had no real evidence. There were no witnesses, and they'd searched Dorothy's house repeatedly at this point and they hadn't found anything useful. And there were no forensics on Dorothy's body since her body had been in the water for so long. All the forensics had been washed away. But just then, there was a knock on the door and an officer poked his head in and told Vale Lungo that he had something that he might want to come see. And so Vale Lungo got up and he walked over, and the officer said that they had just brought this guy in for writing bad checks. And it turns out his former employer was Dorothy Thompson. Vale Lungo was immediately interested and asked for more information, and the officer told him that this man's name was Ulkin Childress, and he had been the live-in caretaker for Dorothy for 2 months last fall. And Ulkin had told the officers who had arrested him that the reason he'd wanted to work there at the pet cemetery for Dorothy was to find the treasure. Apparently, along with all the other rumors about Dorothy, there was another rumor that hundreds of thousands of dollars were buried somewhere on Dorothy's property, and Ulkin had become obsessed with finding it. But he said he never did. When Vale Lungo heard this, he felt his pulse pick up. He'd never heard this treasure rumor, but it wasn't any crazier than any of the other rumors he had heard about Dorothy. And if Ulkin was that serious about finding, said treasure, maybe he'd gone to Dorothy and tried to force her to tell him where it was. But before he could say or do anything, The officer told Vale Lungo not to get too excited because O'Kin had an alibi for the night Dorothy went missing, and it checked out. However, the officer said that O'Kin had mentioned something else that could help with the investigation. According to O'Kin, there was somebody in Dorothy's life who befriended her for the sole purpose of trying to inherit everything she owned, and that person was Patricia Newman. And as soon as the officer said that, Vale Lungo's gears in his head began to turn and he thought, why didn't I see this before? After all, it was Patricia who called the authorities. She's also the one who aggressively pushed this investigation in the early days, which, Vale Lungo had assumed was just because she was worried about her friend. But now he was starting to wonder if maybe she was trying to make herself look innocent. It's not unusual for killers to try and insert themselves into investigations to seem cooperative or to cast suspicion on other people. Patricia had also entered Dorothy's house multiple times before Dorothy's body was found, which certainly gave her an opportunity to interact with the scene and potentially hide evidence. And so Vale Lungo turned and ran to go find Strata. They needed to speak to Patricia immediately, and this time it would be as a suspect. On May 8th, so 6 days after Dorothy was found in the river, Vale Lungo once again met with Dorothy's close friend Patricia Newman. But this time the meeting was inside of a police interrogation room. And as Vale Lungo sat at the interrogation table looking at Patricia, he was watching her very carefully. She did seem somewhat annoyed that she had been called in for this, but she also seemed very nervous. In particular, she kept fidgeting with her hands. Now Vale Lungo had really considered his approach here, since Patricia could have been lying to him this whole time. His plan was to start off pleasant and kind of lull her into a false sense of security that he believed everything she had said was true so far, and then at some point he would surprise her with a sharp left turn and see how she reacted. So he started with some background questions about Patricia's relationship with Dorothy and nodded appreciatively as Patricia explained how she and Dorothy were good friends and Patricia also took care of her. But then, kind of out of nowhere, Vale Lungo asked her about Dorothy's estate and if it was valuable or not. She did say that Dorothy owned the house and the land it was on outright, so no mortgages or anything, so it had to be worth something. But she didn't know how much it was worth. Vale Lungo responded to this by saying, okay, forget the financial worth of the property. Is the property worth something to you, Patricia? At that point, Vale Lungo could clearly see, Patricia realizing what was happening here. She had this alarmed look on her face, like she was starting to see that she was not being treated like a witness but rather a suspect. And so Patricia quickly said, no, the property was not worth anything to her. She didn't want it, not at all. But she kind of turned it around on Vale Lungo and said, look, if you're looking for someone who does want that property, well, you ought to speak to the no-deers. Now Vale Lungo knew who she was referencing. These were the folks who were embroiled in that lawsuit with Dorothy before she went missing and was found dead. But Vale Lungo didn't say anything. He just sort of gave Patricia a look like, oh, explain what you mean. And so Patricia took the cue and told him that the no-deers had been Dorothy's live-in employees for years and they were complete monsters. She said that Brandon had been verbally abusive towards Dorothy while he worked for her. And also he was one of the main people spreading all these rumors about Dorothy in town, about how he thought she killed her husbands, and how Hurlin was haunted, and she was crazy. But she said that wasn't even the worst of it. She said Brandon was also a thief. She said the year before, when Dorothy was on a lot of medication for depression, like more than normal, and she was not of sound mind as a result of it, she said that Brandon and his wife Bonnie had convinced her to sign over her property to them for basically nothing. And that's when it hit Vale Lungo. Like he was aware that there had been this lawsuit over the land, but he didn't really have all the details about it. He just knew there was some dispute. And he also knew that Dorothy's lawyer had mentioned the no-deers days ago, but that was also right before Dorothy's body had turned up and things had been sort of hectic. And so Vale Lungo had not followed up with her lawyers yet, and so he didn't really have the context of, how nasty this legal fight really was. Patricia said she had convinced Dorothy to get a lawyer and to fight this, that it was not right what they were doing to her. And Dorothy had done that. She had gotten a lawyer. And in fact, her and the no-deers court date had happened just 10 days before Dorothy went missing. As Vale Lungo was listening, it was like he couldn't believe it. This was so obvious and it was right in front of him the whole time. The No Deers would clearly benefit from Dorothy's disappearance, and pretty clearly, there was real beef between the parties. So at this point, Vale Lungo kind of shifted tactics and was less interested in looking at Patricia as a suspect and instead assured her that, you know what, he would speak to them. Now Vale Lungo did speak to Patricia for a bit longer. I mean, she was still a suspect. She was very close to Dorothy, who was this older woman with no obvious heirs, and Vale Lungo had not seen Dorothy's will yet, but, you know, he wouldn't be that surprised if Patricia was in there. And if she was, that would prove she would have also benefited from Dorothy's demise, just like the No Deers would. But regardless, Vale Lungo knew he was well overdue for a conversation with the No Deers, so they were going to be his next call. 3 days later, in the afternoon on May 10th, Vale Lungo found himself back in the precinct's interrogation room, but this time it was a bit more crowded. He'd managed to track down 31-year-old Brandon No Deer for an interview, and while Brandon had agreed to talk to Vale Lungo, he had also insisted on having his lawyer present as well, which immediately signaled to Vale Lungo that Brandon likely had something to hide here. Vale Lungo had looked into Brandon's background since speaking to Patricia, and he found out that Brandon had a criminal record which included assault. Vale Lungo also spoke to a few people in town about Brandon, and he had been told that Brandon apparently had a very hard time keeping his mouth shut. He apparently consistently seemed to threaten or go off on people whenever he got even marginally upset. He was a hot-eating loudmouth. So, given all this, Vale Lungo expected Brandon to be at least somewhat antagonistic or defensive in this interview. But when Vale Lungo asked him about this, a highly contentious lawsuit with Dorothy, Brandon didn't seem like an angry loudmouth at all. Instead, he just seemed confused. He explained the whole thing really was just a big misunderstanding. Brandon said he and his wife had known Dorothy for 6 years and actually lived with her for part of the time, and from his point of view, he thought, Dorothy viewed them as sort of like family. And that's also why he said he believed she was selling them her, and at such a low rate. It was like a family discount. He said it just sort of seemed like she really wanted them to have her property. And it was actually Brandon and his wife that had sort of insisted on paying for it. Brandon said, everything about this transaction had really been fine and above board until Patricia Newman got involved. Brandon seemed very frustrated as he began to explain how he didn't really know what had happened. But Patricia somehow got into Dorothy's head and convinced her that he and his wife, Bonnie, had somehow taken advantage of Dorothy. And Brandon saying, that didn't happen. That's not how this went. Brandon said, as far as he was concerned, it actually seemed like Patricia was the one who was taking advantage of Dorothy. And then he said there were actually all these times when, apparently, Patricia was staying with Dorothy and at some point they would get into some kind of fight and Patricia would get mad at Dorothy, and Dorothy would flee her own house and run to the No Deer's house, for protection, for safe haven. They said that was fairly common, Patricia was this awful person that, Dorothy had to flee from. As Vale Lungo heard this, he kind of didn't know what to think. I mean, Brandon could be lying to him, but truthfully, Brandon seemed very convincing. And also, Brandon just didn't really seem smart enough to be a master manipulator here. In fact, if anything, Brandon seemed kind of dense, and it was hard to believe he could engineer this murder without leaving behind any evidence or witnesses, and then also concoct a sort of brilliant story about how Patricia really was the one behind this whole thing. But Brandon's wife, Bonnie, was a suspect too, and it was possible that, she was the ringleader and Brandon had just sort of followed along. They were divorced now, but if they were wrapped up in this lawsuit with Dorothy together, it was possible they could have, come together and join forces to take care of the problem. Get rid of Dorothy. All that's to say, Vale Lungo was not going to eliminate Brandon as a suspect just yet, but he needed more evidence before he could connect him to the crime. So ultimately, he told Brandon he could leave and that he would be in touch. And then Vale Lungo watched as Brandon and his lawyer stood up and filed out of the room. It was sort of funny in a dark way that just a few days ago, Vale Lungo couldn't see any reason why anybody would want to kill Dorothy. And now it was like everybody in Dorothy's life, Ilkin, Patricia, and now the No-Deers, wanted Dorothy's money and so really would benefit if she went away. And so now, he just had to figure out who wanted Dorothy gone the most. About 5 months later, in October of 1985, Vale Lungo stood in the middle of Dorothy's pet cemetery along with Sergeant Strata in total disbelief, because all around them, almost every single tombstone had been completely smashed. Now, Vale Lungo had no idea who had done this, but it was sort of oddly fitting because, just like this cemetery, Vale Lungo's homicide case was a complete and total mess. Since May, Vale Lungo and some other investigators had questioned both Patricia and Brandon No-Deer multiple times, but all they ever did was point the finger at the other one. And now the two primary suspects in Dorothy's murder were essentially at war over her property. After Dorothy's will was read, it would turn out that Patricia Newman had inherited a huge chunk of her estate, including whatever proceeds came from the cemetery business. But the No-Deers were saying that, no, you cannot just give that to Patricia. Because the property is theirs and so the business is theirs because Dorothy had signed it all over to them. And the lawsuit to overturn that sale, despite it being very contentious, it had not been resolved yet, so you can't just shuffle it over to Patricia. And on top of that, Bonnie No-Deer, Brandon's ex-wife, had literally moved into Dorothy's house, making it even more complicated. And so that was why the St. Bernard Sheriff's Department and the state police were at the pet cemetery right now. Patricia was there and trying to get access to the house, and she needed to get some of Dorothy's things, and Bonnie wouldn't let her in. Now, the uniformed officers had just gone there to make sure everybody played nice, but Vale Lungo and Strata had tagged along specifically to try to ask Bonnie a few questions. Now, Bonnie was still very much a suspect in Dorothy's murder, but so far, investigators had actually not been able to interview her, and Vale Lungo had hoped that maybe this was their chance. However, when they arrived, Bonnie was extremely angry and she refused to speak to anyone and told all the officers and Patricia to get off her property. And even though the officers, along with Patricia, had eventually gotten inside and Patricia took what she needed, the officers had not been able to get Bonnie to say anything to them. She refused. And so now Vale Lungo and Strata walked back to their cruiser past all these shattered tombstones, feeling very frustrated that they had multiple suspects here and no way to eliminate any of them. Brandon No-Deer would directly benefit from Dorothy's death because if she was dead, then the lawsuit he was embroiled in would get dropped and he would get dropped and he would get dropped and, by default, take control of Dorothy's land. He also had a criminal record and, according to Patricia, had been horrible to Dorothy when they lived together. Brandon's ex-wife, Bonnie, could have helped him do it too, since after all she was named in that lawsuit as well. And she had taken full control of Dorothy's house after she died, so clearly she was intent on living there. But Patricia also could have been highly motivated to get Dorothy out of the picture, since she was named in the will. And she'd seemed really controlling of Dorothy and had repeatedly inserted herself into the investigation. And then there was the handyman, Ilkin Childress, who had been eliminated through his alibi, but Vale Lungo felt like he deserved another look. He had admitted that he was obsessed with finding treasure on Dorothy's property, and now all the gravestones were mysteriously smashed, which could indicate that maybe he had come back and this was, part of his attempt to find the treasure. Maybe they were inside the gravestones. Then again, if they're going to treat Ilkin like a suspect, well, then anybody who had heard rumors about the treasure on Dorothy's land was also a suspect. And considering how the residents of St. Bernard clearly gossiped a lot about Dorothy, it seemed like that would mean basically everyone in town was a suspect. But without any forensic evidence or witnesses, Vale Lungo didn't see how they would ever be able to connect anybody to this crime. Still, he and Strata got back in the cruiser and headed back to the station to keep at it. The investigative team kept working this case diligently for weeks and then months, interviewing suspects and speaking to people who knew Dorothy. They even met with a psychic who claimed she knew who the killer was, And some people even called in with tips that they had seen Dorothy's ghost in the area, and they would even go follow up in case maybe Dorothy was there. But none of that went anywhere. None of it amounted to any new meaningful evidence that the police could actually use to bring somebody to court. And as time went on, Dorothy's case changed hands multiple times before finally going cold. 24 years later, on a Thursday afternoon in late September of 2009, Detective John Durant sat at his desk in the St. Bernard's Police Precinct doing some paperwork. And he just put his pen down and leaned back in his chair to take a break when another detective poked his head in and told Durant, "Hey, the caller was on the phone." And Durant knew exactly who he was talking about. A few days ago, an anonymous caller had put in a tip to say he had information about an old cold case from 1985, the murder of the lady who owned that pet cemetery. And Durant had known immediately that the caller was talking about Dorothy Thompson. Durant had actually used to cut the grass at the pet cemetery when he was 15 years old. And so, he and his friends knew all about Dorothy, how she was, this eccentric recluse who potentially murdered people and who turned up dead one day. But during the first call, this tipster had gotten spooked and hung up without giving his name. And as soon as Durant picked up the phone to speak to the caller, he immediately said, "Whoever this is, you're not going to get in any trouble here. We just want your name and your location. I want to come talk to you and just hear what you know. You're not going to get in any trouble. Can you do that?" There was a pause, and then the caller reluctantly agreed. Later that day, Durant and another detective sat in the living room of a New Orleans home right across from a very fidgety-looking older man. The man's eyes kept darting all around the room, and periodically, he kept looking over his shoulder like somebody was gonna, jump out at him. And it occurred to Durant as he was watching this guy that he didn't just seem nervous, about the information he was gonna spill to them. He actually seemed pretty genuinely terrified. But, finally, the man took a steadying breath and said he knew who killed Dorothy and he had known for years. Now, the guilt of knowing was haunting him, literally. He told the detectives that he had been seeing Dorothy's ghost, covered in chains, and asking him to come forward. Now at this, Durant raised his eyebrows skeptically, but didn't say anything. This was a pretty crazy start to the story and pretty hard to believe, but at the same time, it didn't really matter what, prompted this guy to come forward. It mattered what he had to say. And so, with an open mind, Durant, along with his partner, just sat there and waited. And eventually the old man, despite being very scared and timid, finally did just come out and say what he knew. Based on a decades-long investigation and multiple confessions, here is a reconstruction of what police believe happened to Dorothy Thompson on the night of April 13, 1985. Sometime after 9 p.m. that night, the killer was sitting behind the wheel of their truck, making their way up the long, winding driveway through the woods towards Dorothy's house. And as they drove along, the killer found themselves sort of looking out the window and taking in the sights, The tombstones, the trees, the house up ahead, the whole property. Taking it all in. And as they did that, they thought to themselves that it was time to stop waiting for their fortune to arrive. They needed to take it because Dorothy did not deserve to have this. In fact, the killer believed Dorothy didn't deserve to live. And so the killer eventually arrived right outside of Dorothy's house, and they stopped their truck. They threw it in park, and then, calm as can be, they got out and they walked around to the back of the house. There they knocked, and eventually Dorothy, made her way to the door, and she looked out through the glass and she saw this person, the killer, and she looked confused. But it didn't stop her from opening the door. And as soon as she did, the killer didn't hesitate. They jumped on top of her. Dorothy tried to scream, but the killer immediately wrapped their hands tight around her throat and she went silent. And then, in silence, they strangled Dorothy until she stopped moving. Then, once Dorothy was crumpled lifeless on the ground, the killer found some sheets and wrapped them around Dorothy's body and then dragged her outside to the waiting truck. Once they put Dorothy's body in the truck, they drove to a section of the Mississippi River not far from Dorothy's house. There the killer got out and they grabbed Dorothy's body and they tied her hands and her feet together and also, just in case, put a plastic bag tightly over her head. Then they wrapped her body in chains, and then, once she was all prepped, the killer, calm as can be, lifted her body up, walked over to the Mississippi River, and threw her in. Moments later, the killer was back inside their truck driving along, feeling better than they had in months, because now that Dorothy was gone, all their problems were solved. It would turn out Dorothy Thompson's killer was indeed Brandon O'Dear. He had not only tricked Dorothy into selling him heroin at a very cheap price, but also, when she figured out he had basically conned her, she sued him at Patricia's urging. And when that happened, Brandon thought, okay, well, if I just kill Dorothy before this lawsuit gets dismissed, cause they're gonna figure out that this was not fair, that I did con her, if I kill her now, well, by default the charges get dropped and the sale goes to me. The property is mine. On the night of the murder, Brandon was not alone. He actually asked another one of Dorothy's former handymen, a guy named James Traeger, to come along with him and basically just wait in the car. And so, he had done that. Now Brandon was an incredibly violent person, and he did not think twice about murdering Dorothy to make sure the lawsuit got dropped. But Brandon also had a famously big mouth, and he told his entire friend group what he had done, and so basically, all of Brandon's friends were aware of this horrible crime. And they totally believed what he said because they were fully capable of him being able to commit extreme violence. But they were scared of him, and that's why none of the friends came forward to say, what they knew. But finally, one of these friends was so haunted by their knowledge of this crime that they did eventually come forward. That was the caller who, told the detectives what happened. And in their rendition of what happened, they said Brandon didn't act alone. There was somebody else, a guy named James Traeger, and so as a result of that tip, it would take another for years, but they would ultimately speak to James Traeger, and he would confess to having been there on that night. And with that, they had enough evidence to finally charge Brandon for the murder. Brandon ultimately surrendered to authorities in 2012, and he would get a 10-year sentence for pleading guilty to Dorothy's murder. Brandon's ex-wife, Bonnie, was not involved. As for James Traeger, the other handyman who drove with Brandon on the night of the murder, he always maintained that he didn't know the murder was going to happen, and so he was given immunity from prosecution in exchange for his testimony. Even though the pet cemetery is still standing today, it's now abandoned and totally overgrown. However, treasure hunters continue to walk around the property, with their metal detectors, hoping that they'll be the ones to finally find the treasure that's buried there. A quick note about our stories: they're all based on true events, but we sometimes use pseudonyms to protect the people involved, and some details are fictionalized for dramatic purposes. The MrBallen podcast, strange, dark, and mysterious stories, is hosted and executive produced by me, MrBallen. Our head of writing is Evan Allen. Our head of production is Zach Levitt. Produced by Jeremy Bowe. This episode was written by Kate Murdoch. Story editing by Karas H. Cooper. Research and fact-checking by Shelley Shue, Samantha Van Hoos, Evan Beamer, Abigail Shumway, and Camille Callahan. Research and fact-checking supervision by Stephen Error. Audio editing and post-produced by Locasio and Colocasio and Colocasio and Colocasio. Additional audio editing by Jordan Stidham. Mixed and mastered by Brendan Kay. Production coordination by Samantha Collins. Production support by Antonio Mann at Ian Dell on Acorley. Artwork by Jessica Klugstreet on Kina. Theme song called Something Wicked by Ross Bugden. Time slowed down as I'm watching this grenade hit my shoulder. As it hit my shoulder, I actually actively thought, okay, you're about to die. There's no escaping it. Oh my God. And I was told I was maybe 30 seconds from death. From my experience growing up, death is a pretty taboo topic. Now, I'm around people talking about death all the time. Are you a big cemetery person yourself? I don't know if I'm a big cemetery person. That's a weird way to phrase it. Yeah, I do think about death. I want to do more with my life with a second chance. I do have that feeling, but it's not nearly as pronounced as... I don't have a fear of death. On today's episode of Storytime with MrBallen, we have a truly unique guest. You'll see in a minute what I mean when I say unique, because what they do... I didn't even know this was a thing, but it definitely is. Because when she made her first post back in 2021 about sort of what she does, it went super viral and, sure enough, what she's discovered really is a phenomenon. But it's one that I promise most of you have never heard of. It's fascinating. Not only do we cover what she does, but it also sort of leads us to this really deep discussion around death, mortality, and what happens when you die. I didn't expect the conversation to go that way, but that's the way it went, and it was great. It was an amazing conversation. I think you're really gonna enjoy it. Also side note, my voice is terrible, but I was just so excited to get this interview in that we decided to push forward. So I apologize for my voice, but it's because I love all you fans of the strange, dark, and mysterious. And so, without further ado, let's get into today's episode. I am Rosie Grant, Aka Ghostly Archive, and this is story time with MrBallen. Alright, so Rosie Grant, I know what you do. I mean, what you do is one of the more unique things I've seen certainly on the internet, or just at large. It's you. You find recipes on gravestones, and you make those recipes, and you post about it online, and you get in touch with the families and the relatives, and it's gone super viral. But I guess now I've explained what you do, but tell me, how the heck you got here, or how did you start doing that? Well, I got started with this when I was trying to become a librarian. I was living in DC and I went to library science school. It was pretty much, I think 2020 is when I started the program, and 2021 I had to do an internship. So it was early days of COVID. At all libraries were closed to new people. And so I interned at the only place that I could find, which was in a cemetery. So, of course, yeah. And you're trying to become a librarian? Yeah, really. Yeah, they were busier than ever. And I mean, it was wonderful. And I should say my parents are both ghost tour guides. So like, being in a cemetery wasn't that weird from things that I did growing up as a kid. Are you a big cemetery person yourself? I don't know if I'm a big cemetery person. That's a weird way to phrase it. Yeah. Have you gone to cemeteries? I've frequented cemeteries. You frequented? I think I was very similar going into this. I frequented cemeteries, yes. But I didn't know anything about the death industry or how that worked. And so I got to basically do digital archives with the archivist, and I would take photos, and I'd go on these site visits to geolocate different gravestones. And I made this sort of online tour of the cemetery. And in the process, I started a TikTok of, like, what's it like to intern at a cemetery? And it pretty much everything came from there. I didn't learn about my first gravestone recipe until maybe 5 or 6 months after starting the account. It was just at first different gravestones and memorials, and then I found a Spritz cookie recipe on a gravestone in Brooklyn, New York. And so you actually brought me some of your Spritz cookies. Yeah. And in full candor, I've already tried them and they're quite good. And actually, as I'm tasting this. So, did you know it was, like, a thing that people literally engrave recipes on gravestones? Did not know it was a thing. I was surprised to find one. So, like in the early days of it. Well, they're good, right? They're, like, nice and buttery. Yeah. Really good. In the early days of TikTok about different memorials, it was just different interesting gravestones. In Baltimore, there's like a Hawaii gravestone, and in other places there's, like, these, like, Edgar Allan Poe has an interesting gravestone. So, I was just featuring, like, unusual gravestones around DC. And so, when it came to gravestone recipes, I learned about Naomi, who has this Spritz cookie recipe in Brooklyn. And I thought, like, what do those cookies taste like? They're on a gravestone. And, like, it didn't just say, like, she liked baking or cooking was important to her. Like, literally as the ingredients to make her recipe. So when I posted it on TikTok, it went, like, super viral, like, overnight. Like, NPR called me the next day and they're like, what's going on with this? And I was like, I have no idea. Like, I've just learned about this woman. And even more so, the no. One comment that I was getting from people, of course people were like, this is so interesting. I've never heard about this. But even more so, I was getting comments like, my mom died a few years ago and I make her cake every year when I miss her. Or, my dad died 10 years ago and I make his chili every Sunday, and it helps me feel like he's closer to me. And it was just these, like, really personal food stories of, like, using food and death, and they blended together when they missed their person. And I was like, there's something here. Like, what is this? Of, like, connecting to the lost loved ones through food. And so I was learning more about Naomi when I learned about a woman named Kay who has a fudge recipe. And then I learned about a woman named Maxine who has Christmas cookies. And that kind of started the journey of learning about gravestone recipes. You speak about these folks like you clearly have put a lot of time into learning about them, not just the recipe. And it seems like you also have a pretty deep connection with some of the family. Is that fair to say? Yeah, I would say. And through the process of it, it didn't begin that way. And the first 3 folks who I learned it about, they were already very viral and online before I came along. Facebook groups had posted about them, lots of online cemetery groups in the world, and they had all featured these 3 over the years. But then as I started learning about more folks, and I think when I was at about each recipes, families started reaching out. And they were starting to say, like, I thought my mom was the only one crazy enough to do something like this. Like, try her cheese dip recipe. And so from there I was like, oh, I need to start interviewing people. And so it became a community archive in the sense of, like, I would reach out to the family members. I have this crazy Google map of, like, where each of the gravestone markers are. I have this insane Google Doc. I have a spreadsheet. This is the library science in me of, like, the data behind each person. But then with each, that would be oral history. So I would interview the families. It would just be, like, who is this person? Who's the person behind the recipe? What does this recipe mean to your family still? And things like that. And I mean, it's at this point now, it's also included traveling. I visited all of the recipes in North America. So I went up to Nome, Alaska, and down to Florida, and New Orleans, and Nova Scotia, and the Midwest, and up and down California. And New York State actually has the most gravestone recipes. So I've been all around New York for that reason. Yeah. And so you are studying for your library sciences degree. My mom actually got her library sciences degree. Get out it. I'm very familiar with how technically difficult it is to get one of those degrees. That's incredible. Oh, I love that. Yeah? Is she a librarian? Or does she work in? She's also a writer and she pioneered writing our podcast. Oh my gosh, I'm obsessed with that, yeah? So, hey, librarians. Yeah, that degree is gnarly. But, so, did you? Yeah, you have this cemetery internship. You go viral with this really unique idea, like basically posting about these spritz cookies from Naomi. How do you go from, well, what I'm doing is I'm getting my library sciences degree on a course to be one of the most, like, introverted, like, quiet, private lives being a librarian, to now you have this amazing new book called To Die For, a cookbook of gravestone recipes. This is incredible. Is this all the recipes that you've done? All the recipes with all the family approvals. There's a few more that I haven't gotten approvals from the family yet, but these are the ones that I was able to connect with, visit, photographed, and of course learn their stories. So that was kind of Ugh. It did become a lot more public and social than I think I was expecting, yeah. So like, how have you responded to this new life path? Or do you feel like you're still sort of like what's going on? I am still. I think every time I find a new gravestone recipe I'm like, and that's it. With the door shut, I have no more people to research. But now it's kind of turned into this. It's grown almost beyond me. I'm getting phone calls. Some of the folks featured in this book, they learned about it from the project. So they, like, had seen a TIKTOK and then their parent. Ugh. They decided to do a gravestone recipe for their parent. One of the women who was featured in it, when I connected with her daughter and I was like, hey, your mom has this gravestone recipe. This really good kasha varnish KS, she's buried in New Jersey. And I was like, can I include your mom in the project? And she was like, well, like, what are you exactly planning to do with, like, this information? And I was like, well, I'm working on a book. Could I include your mom in the book? And she's like, are you the right person to be doing this? I was like, oh. I had this, like, whole moment when I was like, I'm just a library science person. Like, maybe I'm not the right person to be doing this. And I should say, I didn't really play up the TIKTOK side, cause I wanted to, like, show my other credentials. And I was like, well, I was an English major and I was a creative writing minor, and I love food writing and all of this stuff. And so she's like, well, there's this TIKTOKer, there's gravestone recipes, and I think she should be doing this. That's me. And I was like, yeah, I'm like, she should be doing this also. That's me, yeah. What has this experience of becoming the go-to person too, you know? Talk to these families and make these recipes and sort of connect with the dead, in a sense. Well, what has that done for, I guess, your relationship with mortality? That's a great question. And I would be curious to hear what your kind of entry point is. Cause like death, from my experience growing up, death is a pretty taboo topic. I think my parents are ghost tour guides and we go to cemeteries all the time. We love visiting cemeteries and death is still really taboo. And my parents don't want to talk about where do they want to be buried? How do they want to be remembered? It's just like a very uncomfortable topic, cause it implies that we will die, which we will die, which we will die. Well, unfortunately, yeah, exactly. And I think growing up, I remember my first, awareness of that I would die and my loved ones would die, and I went to my great-grandmother's funeral. I think I was maybe 7 and dumb. Right afterwards, my cousins were planning a trip to Disney World and they invited me and I said no, cause I was like, what if my parents die? So I didn't go to Disney cause I was so scared of, my parents just randomly died while I was gone. But I was really freaked out by it as a kid and I was so, consumed. I remember reading books and just, I was so freaked out by it. And I think moving into adulthood, I had a girlfriend die in college we were English majors together, and I was. I just did not know how to process it. Didn't know how to talk about it with friends. And my whole little friend group who this girl was a part of just kind of fell apart. And so we had no idea how to process it and talk about it. So then flash forward to now where I feel like I'm around people talking about death all the time. And it honestly has taught me that it gets easier the more you talk about it. Which is kind of why I like gravestone recipes in the sense of, it's easier to talk about food to be what meals do you like? How do you want to be remembered? You make really good cookies. Do you want that to be served at your funeral? Maybe you don't even want a gravestone. Maybe you want your ashes scattered somewhere that's important to you. Maybe you like this song and you want this played at your funeral, or you want this on your deathbed. So there's just, a lot of things. And, the idea that it's healthy to talk about these things, This is also, I should say, based in the death positive movement. Are you familiar? I saw a reference to that in one of your interviews. Oh, no way. Not familiar with. I wasn't either until this. It started in hospice, basically. This idea that people in society are better off if we talk about these things. It's not like, yeah, death, like, we're gonna die someday. Yeah, but it's healthy if we, like, talk about these things with loved ones. Of, like, how do you want to be remembered? And again, I think food to me is a much easier access point to it rather than, like, the sense of, like, failure or whatever that we'll all die. So yeah, in any case, I think I feel a little bit better about it. But I think I still have a journey to go for getting more comfortable with my own mortality. I'll tell you a quick story about my own feelings around mortality. So I was in the military before I, you know, started telling spooky stories on the internet. Oh yeah. And, a natural crossover. Yeah. You know, it is. And, when I was overseas in Afghanistan, we effectively were ambushed on a grenade actually detonated, holy crap, quite literally next to me. Oh my god, yeah. And in fact, when the grenade came over the wall. It's nighttime. I'm on night vision, and, so the way. There was a drone overhead that was shining down on us with infrared light. You can only see it on night vision. So, like, to the world it's pitch black, but in this circle of light that we're in, we can see. Wow. And on night vision, the light began to strobe, which is actually a targeting system. It means the drone is saying, we're gonna attack hero. It was a mistake, but I'm basically in a strobe light. Okay, suddenly I'm in a strobe light as this grenade comes over the wall. It's like chaos, and the grenade kept coming in and out of focus because the light cast on it over and over. And in the this took a matter of less than a second for the grenade to literally. But there's this flashing thing coming. Oh my god, time slowed down as I'm watching this grenade. Like, appear, disappear, hit my shoulder. And as it hit my shoulder, I actually actively thought, okay, you're about to die. There's no escaping it. And I remember thinking what a bummer. It was that it was gonna detonate at this point and that my head will be blown off, which is really graphic. But I really... But it's like you experienced that. Yeah. And I was thinking about how I won't be able to, like, my mom won't be able to, like, my mom won't be able to, like, see me again. And I was like, oh my god, like, that was the pain. It wasn't I'm gonna die. It was like, my poor mom. And then, as the grenade is falling in this fraction of a second, it reached my torso. And again, it's just falling, you know, the speed it takes to fall, but everything really did slow down and I thought, okay, I'm still definitely gonna die, but at least my face will be intact and my mom will see me again. And then by the time it reached the ground, I was like, oh, it might just hit my legs, blow my legs off. I might live. This is pretty good. Right. Shoo. So it detonates and I was with 6 other guys that I was in the unit with, and it was honestly horrific. I mean, everybody's down, there's a gunfight going on, and I basically was immobile and I was literally under fire, dragged out to this other alleyway where I'm not safe. There are combatants literally firing rockets and just shooting arbitrarily in our direction. I'm watching tracer rounds, which you can see every period, like when you shoot, like 5 rounds in a row, one shows up. It's like a bright light. I'm seeing tracer rounds skipping all over the place. And the people we've just attacked who are attacking us there, like 15 feet away. At any moment, they could come into this alleyway. And I'm alone in this alleyway cause they're dealing with this huge contact down there. And so I have this, like, I've been mortally wounded. I can't pull my tourniquets to stop the bleeding off of my kit because I just was so weak from blood loss. And so I can't take off the life-saving equipment. I know I'm dying and it's not sad. This is where I'm getting to with mortality. And I tell people this story for this reason. I was not sad. It was shockingly matter of fact. I was sitting in an alleyway anticipating that. I'm like, okay, I should have died down there at the contact site. Now I'm bleeding to death for sure. Or if I don't bleed to death, the people that we are in the middle of a gunfight with are for sure gonna come over here and kill me. And so it was just factual. Like my brain processed it as like, wow, you were about to die. Hard stop. This is in 2014. I was 26 years old. Oh my god. And the thought that was going through my mind in addition to the matter-of-factness. As my vision actually went completely gone, I couldn't hear anymore. So I'm like in this black void, but I'm still alive. All I thought about was my wife, Amanda. And we had made the decision to wait on having children before I went on this deployment, like, oh, we'll have time, right? Oh, we'll have time. And I was like, man, like, I guess we don't have time. And I pictured her on the couch in our home in Virginia, just like, with our cats, just watching TV. And like, probably tonight, someone's gonna tell her that I'm dead. And what I also thought was like, we don't have kids, she's young, she'll be devastated, no doubt. But what's gonna happen here is time's gonna go on and she's gonna marry somebody else and have a different life. She'll respect me and honor me, but I'm gone. And then I also thought, I wonder what the newspaper will say about my death. Not the story, just will they write Jonathan Allen, like, killed in action, Jonathan Allen or killed in action, John Allen. It was just like, I wonder if it'll say my full name or John Allen. These are the things that you're going through of, like fire and everything. One near-death experience after another. That's so crazy. And so, the one guy who was not gravely injured on this contact, there was, like, 7 of us. He was our medic, sort of luckily. Oh my gosh. He's up for all sorts of awards. He came over to me and I could feel him, I couldn't hear or see him. And he put tourniquets on me. And they literally whisked me out, carried me out to a helicopter. They saved my life. Amazing. So I survived, obviously. I survived, here I am, not a ghost. But, you know, the reality for me is that, of course, there was, you know, I had to process this thing, which I really didn't do a good job of for a while. I actually ignored it. I just never talked about it. It took me for years after coming out of Afghanistan to just talk to the guy who saved my life. We're on the same team. We see each other in the halls. We didn't talk, like, 'cause you have to recognize that, yeah. But eventually, when I sort of came around to maybe the death positive side of things, I was like, I need to, like, look at this. I looked at it as, like, a tremendous gift. And it wasn't that, like, now I have a second chance, definitely. The lasting impression it gave me was right now, we are living and we don't think about it. You don't wake up and think, I better make sure my heart beats and I gotta breathe, circulate my blood. You're like, I got 100 emails to whatever. Yeah. You just live, yeah. But what I felt in my, almost certainly had I not been rescued, I would have died. I was in the final stages. I was told I was maybe 30 seconds from death. Oh my god. You're ready to die, you just don't know it. And it's for me. I was very badly injured. I didn't feel anything. If anything, it was just sort of like, yeah, this is it. That said, I'm thinking about my name spelling in the newspaper or something. And what it did for me is it made death feel not scary. Well, and so it's our Oh. I want to do more with my life with the second chance. I do have that feeling, but it's not nearly as pronounced as I don't have a fear of death, yeah? I simply know death is coming, and I do think about death. It informs a lot of my decision-making, like, whatever I want to do, it's timed against how much time I think I think. But it's not sad, it just is. Yeah. And I think people are so weary or scared of, like, what's gonna happen when you die? And granted, I don't really know, but I got close enough to me. Well, it was like you're ready to die, you just don't know it, as messed up as that really is. Yeah, it's like hard because I think I don't want to focus on it on the day-to-day of the fact that, like, I'll wake up and being like, oh yeah, like, people I know might die today, yeah, or tomorrow, or in 30 years, or whatever. And like, once you get kind of over that, like, you can go down the hallway of it's just fear taking over you all the time. Or you can go down the hallway of, like, yes, I accept it and this is okay and I'm gonna live my life. And if anything, I think the idea of the death positive movement is like, well, how? Okay, how do I want to live my life then? Because I can either be really scared about it, or completely ignore it, or I can just live my life. You know, I only have this life that I know for right now. I might as well take advantage of it and, do a very cool storytelling podcast or be a cemetery TIK-doker. Whatever makes us happy, rather than I'm just happy, rather than I'm just he, was than I'm just... Yeah. I think also the pandemic for me. Well, I was a lot more death aware cause I think we were all talking about, like our loved ones might die. And I think I felt very similar of, like, I'm not really thinking about my death in the sense of, like, how am I gonna go out? It's more of, like, well, what will my husband feel about this? And what's he gonna do and what will my siblings do? And like, well, yeah, it's so, I don't know. The brain is so interesting like that. That's crazy. And you mentioned earlier that your folks gave ghost tours, and you've mentioned several times that you have this affinity for cemeteries. Of course, was that because your folks gave ghost tours that you have this interest in cemeteries? Or is this just, like, innate? You've just always been interested in them. I think I've always been interested in them. I find them really peaceful places. When I was in high school, I would walk through a cemetery on my way home, just... That was the shortcut, through a cemetery. And it's fun to, like, read through names and see different, like, funny quotes or inside jokes or people's photos and art. And there's just so many things on different gravestones that I find, like, endlessly interesting. It's like a little piece of each person. And I mean, if you walk through a cemetery in the Midwest, the cemeteries in the Midwest are like everything. Like, someone's fishing boat might be on it, or, like, a photo of their favorite beer can, or, like literally anything could be on a gravestone. So I just... Yeah, I don't know. I really have always liked them. But I'd say more recently I've been learning of, like, what's cemetery preservation like? And what is it like to bring the community in? And what's the history of American cemeteries? And all of the, extra pieces to it other than just the vibe. So, do you plan to put a recipe on your gravestone? I feel like I have to at this point. I have to. You have to. Are you? Yeah. Well, like, do you? Have you and your wife talked about doing a cemetery as well? Or no, Christians? The thing is that could be a topic of discussion. Totally. That is on limits for us. We have not, absolutely. And it's one of those things of, like, you don't usually deal with it until you have to deal with it. I feel like because of, what I do with. With TIKT, okay, and with cemeteries, and I love cemeteries. Of course. Yeah. I mean, I feel like it's an exciting topic, so. I'm working with Congressional Cemetery where I interned, and I'm getting a plot there with my husband. And we're talking about, do we want to be cremated? Do we want this type of burial space? Do we want? Or ashes scary? 'Cause you can buy a plot and just have a memorial but not have your body there. There's new things in death studies these days. Aquamation is the new cremation, where you essentially are. It's the same result at the end of. You just have some, organic materials. But it's just through water. Your body is run through water for, a month and then you turn into this material. Ruth's cremation is just, you're fired up and in a matter of minutes. Basically, you turn into the material. So, aquamation's an option. You can get your body turned into gemstones so your family can have jewelry of you. You can get your body shot into space. You can get your body turned into a body farm or donated to science. You can There's these things called mushroom pods now, which I'm still learning if that's, how legit that is, but it sounds interesting of, you put this body into a suit and then it sprouts, new organic materials. And it's very circle of life kind of thing. And I think for me, some of the things that I care about is I want people to miss me when I'm gone. I want to be mourned, but then I kind of want people to move on with their lives. I would much prefer, slowly fading into the distance over time. I guess I'm balancing at one point of, it's important to remember people's names, but also, even cemeteries won't be around for forever. The American cemetery is unusual as a model that we, die and are buried there. I'm given this expectation that you will be taken care of for forever. But for forever means, that could mean anything. And the cemetery could be relocated. Yep, the gravestones could be lost. This happens all the time. And in particular, So, I went to my sister-in-law's Peruvian. I went to Peru a little while ago, and it's you rent a space. And apparently in Europe, there's different more models of it as well. But in a lot of different countries, you rent a space, and then if your family is not around every 5 years to pay for it, a new person comes in and you're just cleaned out. And that's that. But outside of that, yeah, most people, you won't be remembered much beyond a generation or two. And that's okay. It feels like engaging with it a little bit more makes it a little less scary. Not that I know what's going to happen afterwards, but yeah. I don't know. What do you think happens when you die? I don't know. I feel like I listen to a lot of paranormal podcasts for this reason. And I still am but I mean, I was raised Catholic, so I'm probably some sort of amalgamation of, I'm no longer Catholic anymore, but I feel like that gave me the sense of, a soul, and I like the idea that a soul continues on. I don't know what that is or that means. And I think of, I have. Actual. I think my family is very, Pascalian wager of, well, you either know or you don't know, but, it's nice to believe in something. So, I think for us it's it doesn't hurt me to believe that. We'll live on in some way afterwards. Whether it's a second life or we just become particles and my dust scatters in the wind and, there's something very pleasant about that too. What do you believe? I don't know. In a way, forget who said this to me and my wife. It was a family member. I think it was my dad. I was talking about death, or I was Death had come up and it was Well, do you, like, feel bad or do you feel sad about the time before you were born? Well, and I'm like, no, it doesn't exist for me. And they're like, yeah, that's probably how death is. Well, and I don't know if that's supposed to be a good or bad thing. And that's also a very, like, sort of, like, intense way of viewing it. But also, yeah, like, there's a sense of, like, why put meaning to it if it just... It is what it is, kind of thing. I think, like, if that is what happens at the end, I'm, like, very... I feel very, like, not emotionally attached to that. Again, I think, like, for me, like, in my day-to-day or even in the work that I do. Now, like, I like to think that, like, there is something else. I don't know what it is. It's not that I even necessarily am, like, a heaven and hell person, but I'm like, it's nice to believe that there's something. Like, and I think about this again, maybe less for myself, but more for, like, my parents and my siblings and my loved ones and my friends, where I'm like, you know, what are you gonna do with the fact that, you know, like, every Taylor Swift song and your cats all have crazy names and, like, you have this crazy, like, personal job in this thing. And, like, we have all these memories from our 20 seconds and our 30 seconds. Like, anyways, just like all the micro moments of humanity, I would love to believe gets to continue on somehow. But if it might not. It really might just be like at the end. Yeah, maybe. But I also think that I studied philosophy in college, and I used to love, like, thought experiments where the professor presents something that sort of forces the class to take a stance. And, I find myself literally constantly, I think about this. It's when I go to bed. This is a thought I have all the time. I think about, like, why does anything exist? And it just keeps zooming back. You can have this conversation with anyone. Okay, so right. So here we are, right? Okay, so why are we here? Oh, well, cause our parents and their parents and, like, evolution or maybe a religious reason for it. But either way, like, that's how we got here? Okay. Yeah. Okay. Well, why is the Earth here? Why does Earth support life? Why does life exist? Why is the sun here? Why is the Milky Way here, right here? And if you're like, oh, it's science. Things just are out there. It's just... Yeah, it's like, okay. Why? Yeah. Why? Why does anything exist? Yeah. Because it sort of forces you to realize that if there's a reason for everything to exist, we're part of it. So there has to be a reason. We're here reason. We're here reason. Or it's the complete opposite and we're just like here. We're just here, which is very difficult to grasp. It is, but like, what is this within? What is the universe a part of? Yeah, this is the librarian's child of, like, but I want the information. I know. It is. Someday I really want that information. All the stories that I bet they have. But I know. It is really. I mean, that's maybe like... Oh, this is a very selfish thing that I do hope there's something else. I think, like, I would love to just, like, either. You know, I die and I get some sort of, like, spirit guide who's like, hey, like, ask any question and, like, you have infinite access to just what is reality. And I'm, like, very excited. And I want to be like, I want to know everything. Like, I just... I'm so excited if that's the thing. And if that's the case then, you know, it doesn't really matter either way. But, like, I just want to know everything. I know mysteries of history. I've, like, I just... I'm like, I just want to ask all the questions. Of, like... I honestly had never thought to think beyond our planet because there's so many questions I have about our planet. Yeah, that I'm like, oh, well, I maybe know that. Like, will I just have? Does the universe just become this, like, interconnected soul? Like, I guess this is a very Karyam way of thinking about it of, like, just like one body of universe. And that's why we have archetypes, because it's just like a shared consciousness and we just go back to that afterwards. But then you know everything. So I love the idea of that. That would be very cool. But who knows? Yeah, it might not. I don't know. So what would you say is something that you've learned explicitly from doing what you do? Like, it's one thing you've learned. How to make a good chocolate chip cookie. It's very practical. Yeah, but I would also say, like, I think we celebrate death, and death traditions can change so much. Like, I think for me, I grew up with... like, food and death were very disconnected. A comment that I get quite often on TIKTOK is like, EW, you bring food to cemeteries. Like, that's so disgusting. But also, like in the early days food, people would picnic in cemeteries. We have tabletop gravestones, and the first American national park was the cemetery. Before we had official national parks. So, and yeah, people would just picnic on them on the weekends, and you would be like picnicking with grandpa or someone else's relatives. And it was so normal. And nowadays we have, I get some very strange comments of people being like, they're gonna haunt you, or like, that's so disrespectful. And I was like, well, technically from the way that we're taught of, like, how to behave in cemeteries. In some cases, I would have assumed that originally. But now that I've learned the history of cemeteries and even just how other cultures do different food and death traditions. So, in any case, it's just, I've learned a lot about, how people use food to remember someone. Even if, for me, I grew up with being it was a little bit more taboo. I guess everything is taboo, yeah? Lots of guilt, yeah. What did you grow up as? I was Unitarian Universalist. Very nice, yeah? What does that mean? I don't know. It was very open-minded. It was sort of like, you believe what you want. You do you. It's great. I love that. No, that's so rad. And I wish we'd probably all benefit from being a little bit more like that. Catholics were very fire and brimstone. I do love a Catholic cemetery. They have a lot of, motifs. And I guess when it comes to, death, we have, the body and blood of Christ, which is a lot of food and death. You eat this true thing, and so there's something. I haven't looked too much into that, but I'm there has to be something thereof. Death is very associated with the traditions of food. We have meals together, we have... I'm Irish, and so, we have the Irish wake, where we gather around the casket of the person who just passed away, and we're drinking around them. And that's cool. You know what I mean. That's... I don't know. So, a lot of tradition around death. Oh, for sure. It's much more than I think we realize. Across cultures, and food is a big part of it, exactly. Does your family have any particular, funerary traditions that you all do? No, yeah. No, but I feel like we need to get into this death-positive movement. Hell yeah, that's great. What was, do you mind if I ask, the last funeral that you went to? My aunt. Oh, nice. Yes, she died in 2012. Oh, I'm so sorry. Yeah. No, it was. Ugh. She was the first person I watched die. Well, so she had breast cancer. She, Andy, she, Andy, she, it was crazy. She was, like, fine, she was 45. Oh my gosh. And then she went home. She was living in Seattle with her twin boys and her husband. And, she just went back in for pneumonia. And it actually really was sort of a... not a big deal. Oh my goodness. I was out in San Diego for military training and my family was like, hey, Andy's going back in the hospital. But it's really just sort of an overabundance of precaution here or caution here. Yeah, she has cancer, but it just spiraled. And then, before long, I was flying to Seattle. And oh my goodness, Andy's like so full of life. Yeah. And I walked into the hospital and I know she's gonna die. It's very clear. And, her husband's there and he's sort of in shock. And my dad and his brother, so her brother. And I went and just, held her hand. Well, in a way, because I was the nephew and I was definitely close with her, but, my father and his brother and her husband, they're their husband, but this is so deep cutting. It's almost like they can't quite be here in the moment. And I sort of almost intuitively recognized that, I'm just gonna be super close to Andy, cause she's here still. Yeah. She seems to know we're in the room with her, but she's doing, the death rattle. It's like the end of her life. And I held her hand and I was like, it's okay, you can go. Yeah? And then watching her, well, it's it was profound and beautiful and fucking devastating. Yeah. What a gift that you gave to her, though, being there with her. I mean, I feel like people do full death doula trainings literally, just to sit next to someone while they're there. Cause there's something. I heard a peacekeeper, someone who, worked as a peacekeeper saying something like this, and maybe you are this type of person of, you're either two types of people in life. You're the person who is stopping people from jumping off of the cliff and, you're... it's very preventative. It's maybe more at a distance. Or you're the person at the bottom of the cliff, working with people who have fallen off of the cliff, and it's very, face to face. And I feel like people who do grief work, death doulas who can just sit at the bedside, are the people at the bottom of the cliff who are things went on beforehand that are out of my control, but I'm with you now and, I can be here. And, a lot of times you can't be one or the other. I think some people can do both. I think I'm more of a top of the cliff person. But maybe you're a bottom of the cliff person. Yeah. I mean, the other side to this, truthfully, is... and I haven't talked about this, but, so, the Andy's death, that's, my family and it was, it was really difficult, still is. But then when I was deployed overseas, I saw death in a very different way. Yeah, I mean, candidly, I saw as a Navy SEALin, we're going out, effectively with the intent to do harm. Yeah, I mean, no matter how you want to cut it, it's... no matter how you feel about it, that's what active duty... yeah. And I remember, one of the first times that, it wasn't me, but somebody on our team took somebody else's life, and I had to, it's called Seek. There's a machine you use to fingerprint people. Oh, wow. It's like, it's an archive of all the people. And this, for the record, the person we took out, like, they actively shot at us, yeah? It isn't like it was a whoops, we got it wrong, whoops. Well, this is kind of how it is, yeah? Right? And again, like, people can make the claim that we shouldn't have been in the first place, whatever. Sure. But I remember I was fingerprinting him and he was dead, and the sun had just come up, and we're in his compound in his house. And I had this really difficult sort of realization that, like, if the roles were somehow reversed and, like, I'm in my home in the United States. Like, would I take up arms against a foreign country that had come into my country? Probably. I probably would. And he had family, I'm sure. They were fine. But I'm like, fingerprinting him and he's just been killed. Well, so he's, like, fully looks alive minus gunshots. And I, like, had to tell myself that this was different than Andy. Like, this is his. Wow, that, like, came through your head. Well, 'cause I what? There was, like, empathy even though. Like, there's no more gunfighting, like, there's nothing happening now. We are at the full. Like, it's over and done with, and I were just processing the scene. And theirs, it's very professional. Like, the post-contact is very professional. We all just do our jobs, and mine was just fingerprint. And I couldn't help but have that sense of humanity of, like, feeling bad, even though I'm not kidding. I walked into a hallway and I went up a stairwell before he was shot, and my teammate came right behind me and the guy was laying and waiting. Shot a shotgun that hit my teammate right in the chest, and it turned into this whole thing. So it was like this horrible thing. Yeah. He lived. But yeah. Like, I think that I left Afghanistan especially with my own brush with death and even that, and several other people that I seeked. Yeah. It's hard not to feel that humanity even in the worst of places and in a situation where you've sort of been in. You've almost been told to look at them not at, like, they're not like Andy. They're not like Andy. They're different. The same way they look at me is different. Yeah, but we're all just, like, bags of blood and bones trying to make sense of the meat suits. Yeah, it's difficult to grapple with. I think, like, that's a good thing, though. I mean, it's 'cause I'm imagining it would be really difficult to hold on to, like, a sense of humanity and to be able to, do your job. I don't know, I think that's really... There's something really, like, there's a spark there of the fact that you got to experience that. That basically. It almost sounds like your aunt was there with you while you were experiencing that. Like, I don't know, these are things like that that make me believe in a soul. I think that's fair. I think it does. I think that there's also, it's such a big part of human experience. Totally. Imagine that there's some element that is a soul. Yeah. Why does religion exist to begin with? Because everybody over humanity has thought about it. Yeah, exactly. It's not like one day we said, I think religion's a thing. Yeah, like for the sake. Yeah. Oh. Like all of time, it seems like there's been some idea that there's a higher power of some kind. Totally. And, like, I hope there is. I hope there is. And, like, whatever it looks like, I'm so down for whatever tradition it turns into. But, like, it's nice to think about these things and then, like, yeah, I feel like... I mean, what an extreme scenario of, like, you're seeking and your aunt is there on some level with you, whether it's just, like, presence of mind. And I think, like, This is so. Have you ever, this is like such a tangent, but I swear it has. This is just reminding me. Have you ever seen a psychic before? I think, but only as a child, and it was sort of ad hoc and it was not serious. Totally. Well, I know you saw The Mentalist in a previous episode. Yes, and that also... I'm still curious, like, there's so many, there's a lot too, to unpack with that. But I saw, there's this psychic, and I should say, like, I love paranormal stories. I love ghost stories. I think to me it's like very soft level of engaging in these, like, higher topics. But I saw her, and she asked me to pull up my phone and voice record us during the whole thing. And then she immediately starts talking about my friend in college who died, who took her own life. And she's like, she's really worried about you. And I had been going through when I first moved to law. So this was maybe about 2 years ago that this happened. First moved to law. Very homesick. I'm from Virginia myself. And I was like, I miss home and I miss my family. And I feel very fish out of water. And what am I doing here? And the TIKTOK was doing great. But I think I personally was just really struggling. And I was thinking about my friend a lot who had taken her own life. And I was just like, I don't know. Like she was just like... I just was almost disconnected, but I was just thinking about her all the time. And I go see the psychic, and the psychic is like, yeah, your friend Emily's really worried about you. And I was like, what? Like, only my partner I've talked to about this. Like, and she's like, yeah, like, the one who was probably gonna be a teacher. And I was like, yeah, no, I know this. Who my friend, like, yes, she was gonna be a teacher. That's crazy. And she's like, yeah, like, you need to start doing things for yourself a lot more. You need to start prioritizing a little bit more. And honestly, it was like really crazy to have that confirmation. Because, like, my friend, during some of these, like, just very dark moments where I'd, like, wake up crying and I'd fall asleep crying, cause I'm like, I just miss my family. Like, what am I doing in law? This is awful. And, like, just a lot of, like, dark thoughts. And, like, with those dark thoughts, my friend would be there with me. So, it was so crazy to have, like, a year of this, of my friends just always suddenly being there with me. Like, in my mind, and then an external person would be like, yeah, no, she's with you. She's like, And I will say, like, things have gotten much better. I actually really like my life in law. My partner and I have, like, we moved to a neighborhood that made things so much better. And my friend is less present of mine now that I'm in a good place. And I can't help but wonder if, like, I was being... I don't know, sensing her or something like that, but it was a very strange synchronicity that I keep thinking about with, yeah, I don't know. Again, powerful soul. Who knows? Something's there. I don't know. So, obviously, you have this incredible book that has just come out to die for, a cookbook of gravestone recipes. It's more than just a recipe book. There's stories in here, amazing pictures. You should be very proud of this. It's beautiful. This is incredible. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. This is such an honor to be here all. Thank you. Thank you, Earth.